Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her combat boots and straightened her uniform as she walked across the training grounds of Fort Braxton. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade field, where 282 soldiers stood in perfect formation, waiting for the day's training exercises to begin. Maria had earned her place among the elite Special Operations Unit through years of dedication, countless hours of training, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. At 28 years old, Maria was one of only 12 women in the Special Operations Division. Her compact frame of 5 feet 4 inches often led newcomers to underestimate her capabilities. But those who had served alongside her knew better. She could outrun most of the men in her unit, had expert-level marksmanship skills, and possessed a deep understanding of combat tactics that had saved lives during 3 overseas deployments. Colonel James Morrison watched from the platform overlooking the training field. At 52, he was a career military man who had climbed the ranks through a combination of political maneuvering and old-fashioned intimidation. Standing 6 feet 3 inches with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl, Morrison commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. He had been transferred to Fort Braxton 6 months earlier, bringing with him a reputation for harsh discipline and an open disdain for what he called the softening of the military. Morrison had made no secret of his feelings about women in combat roles. During his first week at the base, he had called a meeting with all the female personnel and made it clear that he believed their presence weakened the unit's effectiveness. He spoke about the natural order of military hierarchy and suggested that women belonged in support roles, not on the front lines. Maria had bitten her tongue during that meeting, but she had noticed the way Morrison's eyes lingered on her when he spoke about maintaining proper discipline. There was something in his gaze that went beyond professional disapproval. It was personal, and it made her skin crawl. Over the following months, Morrison had made Maria's life increasingly difficult. He assigned her to the most grueling details, often scheduling her for back-to-back shifts that would have broken lesser soldiers. He questioned her decisions in front of junior personnel and subjected her performance reports to microscopic scrutiny. When she excelled, despite his efforts to undermine her, his frustration became more obvious. The breaking point came during a routine training exercise on a humid Tuesday morning. The unit was practicing close-quarters combat techniques, with soldiers paired off to demonstrate various defensive and offensive maneuvers. Maria was working with Corporal Dave Chen, a skilled fighter who respected her abilities and treated her as an equal. As they moved through the prescribed sequences, Morrison stepped down from the observation platform and began circulating among the pairs. He criticized technique, barked orders, and generally made his intimidating presence felt throughout the group. When he reached Maria and Chen, he stopped and watched them with obvious displeasure. "Corporal Chen," Morrison said loudly enough for nearby soldiers to hear, "you're going too easy on the sergeant here. This isn't a dance class. Show her what real combat looks like." Chen glanced at Maria, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. They increased the intensity of their sparring, with Chen throwing more aggressive strikes and Maria responding with fluid defensive movements that showcased her training and natural athleticism. Morrison's expression darkened as he watched Maria effortlessly counter Chen's attacks. She moved with a grace that belied her strength, redirecting his momentum and finding openings that would have been fatal in actual combat. The other soldiers had begun to notice the demonstration, forming a loose circle around the action. "Stop," Morrison commanded. "Sergeant Santos, you're telegraphing your moves. Any real opponent would see those defensive patterns coming from a mile away. Chen, step aside. I'll show her how a real soldier fights." The training field fell silent except for the distant sound of machinery from the motor pool. Maria felt every eye on the field focused on their small group. She knew this moment had been building for months, and she recognized the calculated cruelty in Morrison's challenge. He was using his rank and physical presence to humiliate her in front of the entire unit. "Sir," Maria said carefully, "I don't think that's necessary. Corporal Chen and I were following the training protocol exactly as outlined in the manual." Morrison's face flushed red. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sergeant? Are you refusing to follow a direct order from your commanding officer?" The trap was perfectly set. If Maria refused, she would be insubordinate. If she agreed, Morrison would use his size and rank to demonstrate what he saw as her inherent weakness. Either way, he believed he would achieve his goal of undermining her credibility and authority. Maria looked around at the faces of her fellow soldiers. Some showed concern for her situation, while others displayed the blank expressions of personnel who had learned not to get involved in conflicts with superior officers. She thought about the 3 years she had spent proving herself to these men and women, earning their respect through competence and courage. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I'm not questioning your judgment." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Outstanding. Let's give these soldiers a lesson in real combat technique." He began removing his jacket and hat, handing them to a nearby lieutenant. Underneath, his muscular frame was evident even through his uniform shirt. Morrison had been a boxer in college and had maintained his physical conditioning throughout his military career. He clearly intended to use his size advantage to maximum effect. As Morrison stepped into the training circle, Maria noticed something in his eyes that went beyond professional instruction. There was anger there, and something else that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. This wasn't about military training or unit effectiveness. This was personal, and Morrison intended to settle what he saw as a challenge to his authority through physical domination. The 282 soldiers formed a larger circle around them, creating an impromptu arena. Maria could hear whispered conversations and the shuffle of boots on dirt as personnel positioned themselves for the best view. She knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would define not just her own standing in the unit, but potentially the future of every woman who served under Morrison's command. Morrison rolled his shoulders and flexed his hands, making a show of his preparation. "Don't worry, Sergeant," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll take it easy on you. We wouldn't want anyone to get hurt during a simple training exercise." Maria said nothing, but she began her own mental preparation. Years of martial arts training, combat experience, and psychological conditioning kicked in as she assessed her opponent and the situation. Morrison was bigger and stronger, but he was also overconfident and angry. Those could be advantages for someone who knew how to use them. Morrison circled Maria like a predator sizing up prey. The circle of soldiers pressed closer, creating an intimate arena where every movement would be visible to the entire unit. Maria kept her breathing steady and her stance relaxed, drawing on years of training that had taught her to remain calm under pressure. "The key to effective hand-to-hand combat," Morrison announced to the assembled troops, "is understanding leverage and using your opponent's weaknesses against them." His eyes never left Maria as he spoke. "Some soldiers think that speed can overcome strength, but that's a dangerous misconception that can get you killed in real combat." Without warning, Morrison lunged forward with a straight punch aimed at Maria's shoulder. It was clearly intended as an opening move that would demonstrate his superior reach and power. Maria sidestepped smoothly, allowing his momentum to carry him past her position. She didn't counterattack, simply reset her stance and waited. "Good defensive movement," Morrison said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but good. "But defense alone won't win fights. Sometimes you have to take the initiative and press your advantages." He came at her again, this time with a combination of strikes designed to overwhelm her defenses. His first punch was a feint toward her head, followed immediately by a powerful hook aimed at her ribs. Maria ducked under the first strike and deflected the second with her forearm, the impact sending a shock through her arm that confirmed Morrison's considerable strength. The assembled soldiers watched in tense silence as their commanding officer and one of their most respected non-commissioned officers engaged in what appeared to be a standard training demonstration. But those closest to the action could see the increasing aggression in Morrison's movements and the careful precision of Maria's responses. Morrison's third attack revealed his true intentions. He threw a powerful right cross that was aimed not at Maria's torso or arms, but directly at her face. The strike had enough force behind it to cause serious injury, far beyond what any training exercise would require. Maria barely managed to slip the punch, feeling the wind from Morrison's fist as it passed inches from her nose. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think the demonstration has shown enough technique for the troops." Morrison's response was to grab for her uniform shirt with his left hand while drawing back his right for another strike. "The demonstration ends when I say it ends, Sergeant. Maybe you'd prefer to discuss this in my office later, when we can have a more private conversation about your attitude." The threat was unmistakable, and Maria realized that Morrison had orchestrated this entire situation to put her in an impossible position. If she continued to defend herself, he would escalate his aggression until she was forced to either take serious damage or fight back, with potentially career-ending consequences. If she tried to end the demonstration, he would use it as evidence of her weakness and unsuitability for combat roles. But Morrison had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that Maria's military training was her only source of combat knowledge. He didn't know about the years she had spent studying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or the countless hours she had dedicated to understanding leverage, timing, and the mechanics of human anatomy. When Morrison's left hand grabbed her shirt, Maria didn't try to pull away. Instead, she stepped closer to him, inside his reach where his size advantage became a liability. Her right hand shot up and grasped Morrison's left wrist, her fingers finding the precise pressure points that would compromise his grip strength. At the same moment, her left hand moved to his elbow, controlling the joint and preventing him from pulling back or adjusting his position. Morrison suddenly found himself trapped in a position where his own momentum and strength were working against him. "Sir," Maria said very quietly, so that only Morrison could hear, "this needs to stop now." Morrison's face flushed dark red as he realized his predicament. He tried to pull his arm free, but Maria's grip and positioning made it impossible without putting his own shoulder joint at risk. The harder he pulled, the more pressure she could apply to his wrist and elbow. "Let go of me right now, Sergeant," he hissed through clenched teeth. "That's a direct order." "I'll be happy to release you as soon as you step back and end this demonstration," Maria replied in the same quiet tone. "But if you continue to escalate this situation, I'm going to have to defend myself appropriately." Morrison made his fatal error then. Instead of accepting the face-saving exit Maria was offering, his ego and anger overrode his judgment. He threw his weight forward, trying to use his size to overwhelm her defensive position, while simultaneously swinging his right fist in a wide arc toward her head. Maria's response was instantaneous and devastating. She pivoted on her left foot, while maintaining control of Morrison's captured arm, using his own forward momentum to throw him off balance. As he stumbled, she applied a sharp twist to his wrist and elbow that sent lightning bolts of pain through his arm and shoulder. Morrison tried to compensate by pulling back, but Maria had already shifted her weight and position. She stepped through with her right foot, her hip making contact with Morrison's center of gravity just as she executed a perfect arm drag that used his own strength and momentum against him. The result was spectacular and unavoidable. Colonel Morrison, all 6 feet 3 inches and 220 pounds of him, found himself airborne for a brief moment before crashing to the ground with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs and send up a small cloud of dust from the training field. The silence that followed was absolute. 282 soldiers stood frozen in place, their brains struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Their commanding officer lay flat on his back, gasping for air and clutching his twisted arm, while Staff Sergeant Maria Santos stood over him in a perfect combat-ready stance. Maria immediately dropped to one knee beside Morrison, her training taking over. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Morrison's face was a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and rage as he struggled to regain his breath. He tried to push himself up with his good arm, but the fall had clearly shaken him more than he wanted to admit. "I'm fine," he wheezed, though his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. "Help me up." Maria extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Morrison accepted the assistance. She helped him to his feet with the same professional courtesy she would show any fallen soldier, but the dynamic between them had fundamentally changed. The entire unit had witnessed their commanding officer's defeat, and everyone understood that Morrison's authority had been severely compromised. As Morrison stood swaying slightly and nursing his injured arm, Maria stepped back and came to attention. "Sir, should I dismiss the troops and arrange for medical evaluation?" The question was asked in a perfectly respectful tone, but it highlighted Morrison's humiliation. He looked out at the sea of faces surrounding them, seeing everything from shock to barely concealed satisfaction in the expressions of his subordinates. Morrison knew that his career at Fort Braxton had effectively ended the moment he hit the ground. Word of this incident would spread through the base within hours, and his superiors would have to address the situation. A commanding officer who had been physically defeated by a female sergeant in front of nearly 300 witnesses could not maintain effective leadership. Colonel Morrison straightened his uniform with shaking hands, his face cycling through shades of red and pale as the reality of his situation settled in. The 282 soldiers remained in formation, but the discipline that usually kept them silent and motionless had given way to an electric tension. Everyone understood they had witnessed something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years to come. "Dismiss the troops," Morrison said quietly, his voice barely carrying beyond the immediate circle. "Return to your regular duties." Lieutenant Sarah Walsh, Morrison's aide-de-camp, stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, should I call for medical personnel to check your arm?" Morrison's glare could have melted steel. "I said I'm fine, Lieutenant. Carry out my orders." As the soldiers began to disperse, Maria noticed the looks she was receiving from her fellow personnel. Some showed admiration and respect, others displayed concern about the potential consequences she might face. Corporal Chen approached her as the crowd thinned. "Sarge, that was incredible," he said quietly. "But you know he's going to make your life hell now, right?" Maria nodded grimly. She had protected herself and maintained the unit's respect, but she understood that Morrison would use every tool at his disposal to retaliate. A man like him didn't forgive public humiliation, especially when it came at the hands of someone he considered beneath him. Over the next 3 days, Maria waited for the hammer to fall. Morrison avoided the training fields and conducted most of his business from his office, but she could feel his presence like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. She went about her duties with professional competence, training junior personnel and maintaining her equipment, but everyone on the base seemed to be holding their breath. The explosion came on Thursday morning in the form of a formal disciplinary hearing. Maria was called to report to the base commander's office at 800 hours, where she found Morrison seated across from Colonel Patricia Hayes, the installation's commanding officer. Hayes was a no-nonsense veteran who had earned her position through merit and had a reputation for fairness that transcended unit politics. "Staff Sergeant Santos," Hayes began, "Colonel Morrison has filed charges against you for assault on a superior officer, insubordination, and conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer. These are serious allegations that could result in court-martial proceedings. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied. "I understand completely." Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "Sergeant Santos attacked me during a routine training exercise. She used excessive force against a superior officer and endangered my safety. I'm requesting immediate disciplinary action and her removal from special operations." Hayes studied both officers carefully. "Colonel Morrison, please describe the events leading up to this incident." Morrison's version of events portrayed him as a dedicated commander attempting to provide valuable training to his troops when Maria had suddenly and viciously attacked him without provocation. He claimed to have been demonstrating proper defensive techniques when she lost control and used her martial arts background to assault him. When Morrison finished his account, Hayes turned to Maria. "Sergeant Santos, do you have anything to add to Colonel Morrison's description?" Maria had spent the previous 3 days preparing for this moment, knowing that her career and potentially her freedom hung in the balance. She had also done something that Morrison hadn't anticipated. She had consulted with the base legal officer and learned about the importance of witness testimony in military proceedings. "Ma'am, I respectfully disagree with Colonel Morrison's characterization of events. I defended myself when he escalated a training exercise into what I perceived as a physical assault. I used minimum necessary force to protect myself and immediately offered medical assistance when the colonel was injured." Morrison's face darkened. "That's completely false. I was conducting standard military training when—" "Colonel Morrison," Hayes interrupted, "were there witnesses to this incident?" "Well, yes, but—" "How many witnesses?" Morrison's jaw clenched. The entire Special Operations Unit was present, approximately 282 personnel. Hayes made a note on her pad. "I see. And have any of these witnesses been interviewed regarding their observations?" This was where Morrison's arrogance worked against him. In his rage and embarrassment, He had filed charges immediately without considering that nearly 300 soldiers had watched the entire incident unfold. He had assumed that his rank would be sufficient to ensure that his version of events would be accepted without question. "I didn't think it was necessary to," Morrison began. "I think it's very necessary," Hayes said firmly. "Lieutenant Walsh, please arrange for interviews with a representative sample of the personnel who witnessed Tuesday's training exercise. I want detailed statements from at least 20 soldiers, selected randomly from different units and rank levels." Over the next 2 days, a parade of soldiers testified about what they had observed. The stories were remarkably consistent. Morrison had escalated a routine training demonstration into an aggressive personal confrontation. He had thrown punches with obvious intent to cause harm. Maria had initially tried to de-escalate the situation and had only used force when Morrison left her no alternative. Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, a 15-year veteran with an impeccable record, provided the most damaging testimony. "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of training exercises in my time, and what Colonel Morrison was doing wasn't training. He was trying to hurt Sergeant Santos. She showed incredible restraint and professionalism under circumstances that would have made most soldiers lose their composure." Corporal Jennifer Walsh, who had been standing near the front of the crowd, testified that she had heard Morrison make threatening comments about private conversations with Maria. Several other soldiers confirmed that Morrison's strikes had been aimed at Maria's head and face, far beyond what any legitimate training would require. The most compelling testimony came from Master Sergeant William Torres, the unit's senior enlisted advisor. Torres was a highly decorated soldier whose word carried enormous weight in military proceedings. "Colonel Hayes," Torres said, "I've served under a lot of commanders in my 22 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened on Tuesday. Colonel Morrison created a hostile situation for personal reasons and then tried to use his rank to intimidate and physically harm one of our best NCOs. Sergeant Santos handled herself with more professionalism than I would have shown in her position. When the interviews concluded, Hayes called both officers back to her office. Morrison entered with obvious confidence, still believing that his rank would protect him from serious consequences. Maria remained cautious, knowing that military justice didn't always follow logical paths. After reviewing all available evidence and witness testimony, Hayes began, "I'm dismissing all charges against Staff Sergeant Santos. The evidence clearly shows that she acted in self-defense after being placed in an untenable position by her commanding officer." Morrison's face went white. "Ma'am, surely you can't take the word of enlisted personnel over that of a senior officer." "Colonel Morrison," Hayes said sharply, "I'm taking the word of nearly 24 credible witnesses who all saw you initiate an unprovoked assault on a subordinate. Your conduct was not only unprofessional, but potentially criminal." Hayes turned to Maria. "Sergeant Santos, you handled an extremely difficult situation with remarkable restraint and professionalism. Your actions reflect great credit on yourself and this installation." Morrison was reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon within 2 weeks, effectively ending his field command career. The incident became legendary throughout the military community, not just for the spectacular nature of Morrison's defeat, but for what it represented about changing attitudes toward women in combat roles. Maria continued to serve with distinction, eventually earning promotion to Sergeant First Class and later becoming one of the first women to complete the Army's Elite Ranger training program. She often spoke to junior personnel about standing up for themselves while maintaining military discipline and professionalism. Years later, when asked about the incident, Maria would say that the most important lesson wasn't about physical confrontation or even gender equality in the military. It was about the importance of earning respect through competence and character, and about institutions being strong enough to correct themselves when leaders fail to live up to their responsibilities. The 282 soldiers who witnessed that day's events carried the story with them throughout their careers, and many credited it with changing their own understanding of leadership, courage, and what it meant to serve with honor. In an organization built on hierarchy and tradition, they had seen that true strength came not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the wisdom to know when and how to stand firm against injustice.